The city never looked more beautiful than it did at night, and Julia Munoz had learned to appreciate that small mercy during the loneliest hours of her existence. Hello, my lovely family, and welcome to Noir Heirloom Tales. Before we begin, if you're watching right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Don't forget to like this video and turn on your notifications, because the stories here are meant to be felt, not just heard. Let's begin. 3 a.m. 47 floors above the streets of Manhattan. The kind of silence that only money could buy, thick, suffocating, absolute. Her cleaning cartwheels squeaked against the marble floors of Owens Tower's executive level, the only sound brave enough to exist in this temple of wealth and power. Julia had been invisible her entire life. At 26, she'd perfected the art of it. Keep your head down. Do your job. Don't ask questions. Don't make eye contact with the people who worked here during daylight hours. The ones in their designer suits and confident smiles, the ones who looked through her like she was part of the furniture. She preferred the night shift anyway. No one to see the fraying edges of her uniform. No one to notice that her work shoes were held together with super glue and stubborn hope. No one to ask why someone with her face, her mother always said she had her grandmother's eyes, dark and defiant, was pushing a mop instead of. Instead of what? Julia shook her head, spraying cleaner on the glass wall of yet another corner office. Dreams were dangerous. Dreams were for people who could afford them. She was here for one reason: her mother's medical bills. Stage 3 cancer didn't care about dreams. It cared about copays and experimental treatments, and the kind of numbers that made Julia's stomach turn every time she saw them. So she worked. The hospital during the day, cleaning office buildings at night. She worked until her hands ached and her eyes burned, and she told herself it was enough. It had to be enough. The executive level was always last on her route. 68th floor. Where the real power lived. Where Jason Owens himself supposedly worked, though Julia had never seen him. Men like that didn't keep the same hours as the rest of humanity. They existed in a different dimension. One where private jets and penthouse offices and decisions that affected thousands of lives were made over glasses of scotch that cost more than her monthly rent. She'd seen his face, of course. Everyone had. Magazine covers in the lobby. News segments playing on the break room TV. Jason Owens, 34, tech mogul and CEO of Owens Industries, ranked among the world's most eligible bachelors. Eligible. As if someone like him would ever exist in the same universe as someone like her. Julia pushed her cart past the executive conference room, past the offices with nameplates she couldn't pronounce, toward the corner suite at the end of the hall. The one with double doors made of some dark, expensive wood. The one that was always locked. Except tonight it wasn't. The door stood ajar. Just slightly. Enough to let a sliver of golden light escape into the dim hallway. Julia's hand hovered over her cart. She should keep moving. Mind her business. But something felt wrong. The silence was different here. Heavier, like the air before a storm. Hello. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. No response. She should leave. Call building security. Let someone else handle whatever this was. But her feet carried her forward anyway, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The door opened soundlessly under her touch. The office was obscene. That was the only word for it. Floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the Manhattan skyline into a personal portrait. Furniture that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. Everything in shades of black and chrome and cold calculated power. And in the center of it all, collapsed against a marble pillar like a fallen god, was Jason Owens. Julia's breath caught. He was devastating. That was the word that came to her mind, unbidden and unwanted. Even in obvious distress, even with his perfect face drained of color and his expensive suit jacket discarded on the floor beside him, he was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Dark hair that fell across his forehead. A jaw that could have been carved from stone. And eyes, God, those eyes, that found hers across the room with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. Don't! His voice was rough, strained. One hand clutched his chest. The other braced against the pillar, knuckles white with effort. Don't call anyone. Julia's training kicked in. She'd seen enough medical emergencies at the hospital. You need help. I'm calling 911. No. The word cracked like a whip. He tried to stand, made it halfway, and his legs betrayed him. Julia moved without thinking, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands reaching for his shoulders to steady him. The contact was electric. Wrong. She shouldn't be touching him. Shouldn't be this close. She could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that probably had a name she couldn't pronounce. Could feel the heat radiating off his skin through the thin fabric of his dress shirt. Sir, you need a doctor. I've seen doctors. His laugh was bitter, broken. Every specialist in the country. Do you know what they tell me? 6 months. Maybe less. Some rare degenerative condition they can't even properly diagnose, let alone cure. So no, I don't need another doctor telling me I'm dying. I already know. Julia's hands stilled on his shoulders. 6 months. This man, this young, powerful, seemingly invincible man was dying. There has to be something. There isn't. His eyes found hers again, and this time, Julia saw past the pain to something else. Something that looked almost like resignation. I've tried everything. Experimental treatments. Alternative medicine. Thrown millions at the problem. Nothing works. Nothing even slows it down. He was shaking now. Subtle tremors that ran through his powerful frame. Julia did the only thing she could think of. She stayed. Kept her hands on his shoulders. Kept herself steady, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. What's your name? His question caught her off guard. Julia. Julia Munoz. Julia. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. You work here. Night shift cleaner. It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. Wondering how he knew. Wondering why it mattered. I've seen you. His eyes drifted closed, his breathing labored. Thought I was hallucinating at first. Sometimes I see things now. Side effect of the medications. But you were real. Every night for the past 3 months, I'd watch you on the security feeds. Working when everyone else was gone. Never complaining. Never cutting corners. Julia's heart stuttered. He'd been watching her? Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Jason's eyes opened, and the look he gave her was almost tender. Almost. Because you reminded me of something I thought was extinct. Honest work. Real effort. You didn't know anyone was watching, and you still treated this place like it mattered. His hand moved, and Julia watched in stunned silence as he reached into his jacket pocket. Pulled out a wallet made of leather, so fine it probably cost more than her car. And from that wallet, a black credit card that caught the dying light like a dark mirror. Take it. He pressed it into her palm, his fingers curling around hers. His touch was fire and ice all at once. I can't. You can. You will. There was command in his voice now. The CEO. The man who'd built an empire before he turned 35. I don't have time to argue. Listen to me carefully, Julia Munoz. His grip tightened. His eyes burned into hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world disappear. I'm going to pass out in about 30 seconds. When I do, you're going to use that card. There's a number on the back, call it. Tell them code silver. They'll understand. There's a facility. A place that doesn't officially exist. They have resources. A treatment that might work. Experimental. Dangerous. Probably illegal. Then why? Because I'm dying anyway. His smile was sharp, painful. What do I have to lose? But I can't authorize the treatment myself. Legal reasons. I need someone else. Someone with access to my accounts. Someone who has nothing to gain and everything to lose. Someone desperate enough to take the risk. Julia's blood ran cold. You don't know anything about me. I know you work 2 jobs. I know you're paying for someone's medical treatment. I know you haven't taken a day off in 11 months. I know you're drowning in debt and too proud to ask for help. His breathing was getting worse. Shorter. I know you're exactly the kind of person who would save a dying stranger because it's the right thing to do. This is insane. Yes. His eyes were starting to unfocus. But you're going to do it anyway. Because if this treatment works, if I survive, I'll pay off every medical bill you have. Your mother's. Yours. Everyone's. I'll set you up for life. And if it doesn't work? He shrugged, the movement weak. Well, at least I tried something different. Sir, Mr. Owens. Jason. His voice was fading now, slipping away. Call me Jason. And Julia? When I wake up, if I wake up, we're going to have a very interesting conversation about what you just agreed to. I didn't agree to anything. But his eyes had already closed. His body went slack against her, his full weight suddenly supported by her arms. And Julia was left kneeling on a marble floor in a penthouse office, holding a dying billionaire and a black credit card that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The card was warm from his touch. On the back, embossed in silver, a phone number. Nothing else. Julia's hands shook as she pulled out her phone. This was crazy. This was beyond crazy. She should call 911. Get him real help. Let someone who actually knew what they were doing handle this. But his words echoed in her mind. I'll pay off every medical bill you have. Her mother's last treatment had cost $40,000. Money Julia didn't have. Money she was still trying to figure out how to find. And here was a stranger, a dying, desperate stranger, offering her a way out. If she saved him, if his insane plan worked, if she was willing to risk everything on a man she'd met 5 minutes ago. Julia looked down at Jason's face, peaceful now in unconsciousness. At the sharp lines of his jaw, the dark lashes against his too pale skin. At the vulnerability of someone so powerful brought this low. She thought about her mother, about the hospital bills stacking up like tombstones, about the desperate, impossible choice she'd been given. And Julia Munoz, night shift cleaner, invisible woman, made a decision that would destroy her life or remake it entirely. She dialed the number. The phone rang once. Twice. A voice answered. Cold. Professional. Code. Julia took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. Code silver. There was a pause. Then, location? Owens Tower. Executive level. 68th floor. Secure the area. We'll be there in 4 minutes. The line went dead. Julia sat in the silence of the penthouse, a dying man in her arms and a black card in her hand that promised either salvation or damnation. She had no idea which. But as Jason's breathing stabilized slightly, as the city lights glittered outside like false stars, Julia realized one terrible truth. She'd just stepped into a world she didn't understand, made a bargain with a man she didn't know, and tied her fate to someone who might not live to see tomorrow. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear and the shock and the impossible weight of what she'd just done, something else stirred. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The elevator dinged in the distance. Footsteps approached. Fast. Professional. And Julia held on to Jason Owens like he was the only solid thing in a world that had just stopped making sense. Whatever came next, there was no going back. She'd made her choice. Now she'd have to live with the consequences. The hospital smelled like bleach and expensive failure. Julia stood in the doorway of the private suite, her cleaning cart abandoned somewhere 3 floors below, her polyester uniform stiff against skin that suddenly felt too aware of its own cheapness. The black card in her hand weighed nothing, barely a slip of metal and mystery, but her fingers trembled around it like she was holding a loaded gun. Beyond the glass wall that separated this room from the ICU hallway, nurses moved with urgent precision. Machines beeped in rhythms that sounded like countdown timers. And in the bed, beneath sheets that probably cost more than her monthly rent, Jason Owens lay dying with the kind of stillness that didn't look like sleep. It looked like surrender. Julia took a step inside, then another. The door whispered shut behind her, sealing her into a silence thick enough to drown in. She'd never been in a hospital room like this. The floors were heated marble. Recessed lighting created pools of amber glow instead of the harsh fluorescence she was used to. There was a sitting area with leather furniture, a private bathroom with a door that probably locked, and windows that overlooked the city like it existed only to be observed from this height. This wasn't healthcare. This was a throne room for the temporarily mortal. You're back. Julia's head snapped toward the voice. A woman in designer scrubs, because of course even the medical staff were curated here. stood near the monitoring equipment, making notations on a tablet. She was older, maybe 50, with silver streaking through dark hair pulled into a neat bun. Her eyes were kind but exhausted in a way Julia recognized instantly. The look of someone who'd seen too many people die despite everyone's best efforts. Yes, Julia managed, her accent thickening the way it always did when she was nervous. I came back. The woman's gaze dropped to the black card, still clutched in Julia's hand like a talisman. Something shifted in her expression, not quite approval, but acknowledgement. Dr. Chen spoke with you? Julia nodded, though spoke with was a generous description of what had happened 20 minutes ago in a consultation room that felt more like an interrogation chamber. Dr. Chen, impeccably dressed, clinically direct, had laid out Jason Owens's situation with the detachment of someone discussing a failing stock portfolio rather than a human life. Advanced poisoning. Toxin unknown. Organs shutting down systematically. Days, maybe hours left. Unless. There was always an unless when enough money was involved. There's an experimental treatment, Dr. Chen had said, sliding a folder across the polished table between them. A facility in Switzerland. They've had success with similar cases, but he'd paused, choosing his words like selecting weapons. Not approved in the United States. Not accessible through conventional channels. And extremely expensive. Julia had stared at him, not understanding why he was telling her this. She was the woman who'd found Jason Owens collapsing in his office at 2 a.m. She was nobody. Mr. Owens gave you his card for a reason, Dr. Chen had continued, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. That card has access to accounts that could fund the treatment. But there's a complication. Of course there was. The facility requires authorization from next of kin or a spouse. Dr. Chen had leaned back, studying her with an intensity that made her want to run. Mr. Owens has no living family. No emergency contacts on file. His legal team is unreachable. They're in London, and by the time they return and process the paperwork, it will be too late. Julia had felt the trap closing before he'd even sprung it. Unless someone with authorization, say a fiancé, could make the medical decisions on his behalf. The word had hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. Now, standing in Jason's hospital room with that same card burning against her palm, Julia understood the full weight of what she'd agreed to. Not just agreed, what she'd been maneuvered into agreeing to, because Dr. Chen had known exactly which pressure points to apply. Your mother is still at Sacred Heart, correct? He'd asked, his tone carefully neutral. 3rd floor, room 317. Stage 3 kidney failure. Julia's blood had gone cold. How do you? Mr. Owens is very thorough about the people in his building. Dr. Chen had stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. If you help him now, I imagine he'd be grateful. The kind of grateful that pays off medical debt. That ensures someone's mother gets moved up transplant lists. That transforms lives. And there it was. Not a request. Not even a negotiation. A transaction. Miss Munoz. Julia blinked, pulled back to the present by the nurse's patient voice. Sorry, she swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. What do I need to do? The nurse gestured toward a chair near Jason's bedside. Sit with him while I brief you. The transport team will be here in 40 minutes. You'll need to sign paperwork, and you'll be accompanying Mr. Owens to the airfield. Airfield. Private jet to Zurich. The facility is expecting you both by tomorrow morning, European time. The nurse's expression softened slightly. I know this is overwhelming, but if you're going to do this, you need to commit fully. The moment you sign those documents as his fiancé, you become legally responsible for his medical care. There's no halfway. Julia's legs moved before her mind could catch up, carrying her to the chair beside Jason's bed. She sank into leather that molded to her body like it had been designed for comfort she'd never experienced, and for the first time since entering the room, she really looked at him. God, he was beautiful even like this. It felt wrong to think it, inappropriate, maybe even cruel, but Julia couldn't help it. Jason Owens unconscious was somehow more devastating than Jason Owens collapsing in his office. gasping her name like it was the only word left in his vocabulary. His dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that made her fingers itch to brush it back. His jaw was shadowed with stubble that made him look less like the untouchable CEO and more like a man who'd fought something and lost. The hospital gown seemed obscene on him, too thin and vulnerable for someone who'd worn power like a second skin. But it was his hand that destroyed her. It lay on top of the sheets, palm up, fingers slightly curled as if reaching for something even in unconsciousness. There was an .4 taped to the back of it, bruising already blooming purple beneath tan skin. His nails were clean, manicured, the hands of someone who'd never had to scrub floors at 3 a.m. or wash dishes until their fingers cracked and bled. Yet something about that reaching hand made Julia's chest tighten with an ache she didn't want to name. "Why me?" she whispered, not really expecting an answer. The nurse paused in her notations. "I wondered that myself." She moved closer, lowering her voice even though there was no one else to hear. "But I've worked with Mr. Owens before. Different circumstances. He's particular about trust. Paranoid, even. If he gave you that card, it's because in that moment, you were the only person in his world he believed wouldn't betray him." The words settled over Julia like a weight she hadn't asked to carry. "I don't even know him," she said, staring at Jason's too still face. "Maybe that's exactly why he chose you." Before Julia could process that, the door opened and Dr. Chen entered with 2 other people. A woman in an expensive suit carrying a leather portfolio, and a man who had lawyer written all over him in his perfectly tailored navy pinstripes. "Miss Munoz." Dr. Chen's voice was brisk, professional. "This is Amanda Reeves, Mr. Owens's personal attorney, and Jonathan Kim from the hospital's legal department. They have the necessary documents." Amanda Reeves moved with the efficiency of someone who billed by the minute. She set her portfolio on the small table beside Julia's chair and extracted a stack of papers that looked thicker than Julia's entire life story. "I'll need identification," Amanda said, not unkindly but not warmly either. "Passport if you have it, driver's license at minimum." Julia fumbled for her wallet, hyper-aware of how worn it looked as she pulled out her driver's license with shaking fingers. Amanda took it, glanced at it briefly, and began filling in information on the forms with mechanical precision. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" Jonathan Kim asked, his tone careful. "This grants you medical power of attorney for Mr. Owens. Any decisions regarding his treatment will require your authorization. You'll be legally recognized as his fiancé for the duration of his care." "Duration?" Julia's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Until he's stable enough to revoke the arrangement himself, or," Amanda paused delicately, "until it's no longer necessary. Until he dies," Julia translated silently. "There are benefits, of course." Amanda pulled out another document, this one shorter. "Mr. Owens established an emergency provision some years ago. Anyone granted medical power of attorney in crisis circumstances receives compensation for their time and discretion. $200,000 transferred immediately." Julia's vision actually blurred. $200,000. That was her mother's medical debt. That was rent for 2 years. That was not having to choose between electricity and groceries, between bus fare and dinner, between dignity and survival. That was freedom. Or the prettiest cage she'd ever been offered. "Where do I sign?" The words came out before Julia could stop them, and she watched something flicker across Amanda's face, respect, maybe, or pity. It was hard to tell. For the next 20 minutes, Julia signed her name more times than she ever had in her life. Each signature felt like another lock clicking into place, another door closing behind her. She was vaguely aware of the nurse explaining medications, of Dr. Chen discussing transport logistics, of Amanda providing her with a phone. "Mr. Owens's private line, you'll need it," and a credit card separate from the black one. "For immediate expenses," Amanda explained. "Clothes, food, anything you need. The black card is for medical expenses only, but this one is yours to use as necessary to maintain appearances." Maintain appearances. As if Julia knew the first thing about being the kind of woman who'd be engaged to Jason Owens. Finally, it was done. The lawyers departed with their paperwork. Dr. Chen stepped out to coordinate with the transport team. And Julia was left alone with the nurse and the unconscious man who'd somehow, impossibly, become her responsibility. "You should change," the nurse said gently, gesturing to Julia's uniform. "There's a boutique on the first floor that stays open for family members. Use the card Miss Reeves gave you. You'll need something appropriate for travel." Julia looked down at herself, at the shapeless polyester dress with maintenance, embroidered over the pocket, at the sensible shoes worn down at the heels, at the coat she'd grabbed from the donation bin in the staff room because she'd sold her good one to help pay for her mother's last round of tests. This was who she was. Julia Munoz, Invisible Woman. The cleaner who ghosts saw more clearly than people did. But that wasn't who Jason Owens needed her to be. 30 minutes, the nurse continued. The transport team arrives at 6 a.m. I'll stay with him. Julia stood, her legs unsteady, and moved toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back one more time at Jason's reaching hand, at the machines breathing for him, at the man who'd pulled her into his world with a single desperate act of trust. What if he doesn't remember? She asked quietly. When he wakes up, what if he doesn't remember giving me the card? The nurse met her eyes with a sadness that spoke of too many impossible situations and not enough miracle endings. Then you'll have to make him believe it was his idea all along. The words followed Julia out into the hallway, down the elevator, through corridors that smelled less like bleach and more like money with every floor she descended. The boutique's lights were warm and golden, so different from the fluorescence she was used to. A woman in black greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The kind of smile that said she could tell Julia didn't belong, but was too professional to say so. I need, Julia's voice cracked. She held up the credit card like a white flag. I need clothes. For travel. To Europe. Of course. The woman's smile warmed fractionally. Let's get you taken care of. An hour later, Julia stood in front of a full-length mirror and didn't recognize herself. The woman staring back wore tailored black pants that actually fit, a silk blouse the color of champagne, and a cashmere coat that felt like wearing a cloud. Her hair, usually pulled into a hasty bun, had been brushed out by the boutique woman's gentle hands. Simple gold earrings. Leather boots that didn't pinch. She looked like someone who belonged in Jason Owens's world. She looked like a beautiful, expensive lie. Julia's phone, her old, cracked one, not the sleek device Amanda had given her, buzzed with a text from her mother's nurse. She's asking for you. Worried. Guilt crashed over Julia like a wave. She'd been so consumed by Jason's crisis that she'd barely thought about her own mother lying in a different hospital across the city, wondering where her daughter was. Tell her I'm okay, Julia typed back. Tell her everything's going to be okay. Another lie. But maybe if she said it enough times, it would become true. By the time Julia returned to Jason's room, the transport team had arrived. 2 paramedics who moved with military efficiency, preparing him for the journey ahead. Amanda was there too, along with a man Julia didn't recognize, tall, cold-eyed, wearing a suit that screamed security. This is Marcus, Amanda said. He'll be accompanying you to Zurich. Mr. Owens's protection detail. Because of course a dying billionaire needed bodyguards, even in unconsciousness. Julia nodded numbly, watching as they transferred Jason to a specialized stretcher. His hand slipped off the sheets, hanging down, and without thinking, Julia reached out and tucked it back against his side. His skin was warm, which somehow surprised her. She'd half expected him to be cold already, slipping away. But his pulse fluttered strong beneath her fingertips, a stubborn rhythm that said he wasn't done fighting yet. Hold on, she thought fiercely, surprised by the intensity of her own emotion. Just hold on. The private airfield was a world Julia had never imagined existed. Smooth tarmac, sleek planes that looked more like spaceships than aircraft, personnel who moved like they were choreographing a ballet of extreme wealth. The jet waiting for them was smaller than she'd expected but far more luxurious, all cream leather and polished wood, and lighting that seemed designed to make even a medical emergency feel elegant. They settled Jason in a specially configured medical bay at the rear of the cabin. Monitors were reconnected. IVs checked. The paramedics murmured to each other in medical shorthand Julia couldn't follow, and she found herself relegated to a seat by the window, watching the city lights blur into streams of gold and white as the plane taxied. Amanda sat across from her, iPad in hand, typing with brutal efficiency. You'll have questions, Amanda said without looking up. Everyone does. Is he going to die? That made Amanda pause. She set down the iPad and fixed Julia with a look that was uncomfortably assessing. Honestly? I don't know. The doctors give him a 30% chance with the treatment, 10% without it. She leaned back, her expression carefully neutral. But Jason Owens is the most stubborn man I've ever met. He doesn't accept defeat gracefully. If willpower counted for anything, he'd already be cured. Why doesn't he have family? Julia asked. Everyone has someone. Not everyone. Amanda's voice carried a weight that suggested stories Julia wasn't entitled to hear. Jason's parents died when he was 16. Car accident. He built everything himself after that. The company, the fortune, the reputation. He trusts very few people, and most of them work for him because trust is easier when it's contractual. The plane lifted off, smooth and surreal, and Julia watched her city fall away below. The place where she'd scrubbed floors and counted pennies and believed she understood the limits of her own life. Now she was flying into someone else's world entirely, wearing clothes that cost more than her car, carrying a card that could buy miracles, bound by documents that made her someone she wasn't. Julia closed her eyes and felt the ghost of Jason's hand reaching toward her in sleep. What have I done? She wondered, but she already knew the answer. She'd made a deal with a dying man's desperation. She'd sold her truth for his survival. And somewhere over the Atlantic, as dawn began to break across the ocean in shades of gold and blood orange, Julia Munoz accepted that there was no going back. Whatever came next, whether Jason Owens lived or died, whether he remembered her or looked at her like a stranger, she was part of his story now. And he, God help her, was part of hers. Julia Munoz had cleaned boardrooms before. She'd wiped down these very tables at 3 a.m. when the building was empty and silent, when the only sound was the hum of fluorescent lights and her own breathing. She'd polished the floors where powerful men walked, emptied their trash bins, seen the remnants of their million-dollar deals scattered across desks like confetti. But she had never sat at the table. The leather chair beneath her cost more than 6 months of her old salary. The Hermes portfolio in her lap, a gift from Jason's assistant that morning, felt like a prop in a play she hadn't auditioned for. The designer dress hugged her body in ways her uniform never had, its price tag a number she'd deliberately not looked at because seeing it would have made her physically ill. Everything about this moment was wrong, and yet she couldn't leave. Mrs. Owens, a voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. We're waiting. Julia's head snapped up. 12 pairs of eyes stared at her from around the massive mahogany table. 12 men in suits that probably cost more than her mother's monthly medical bills. The fluorescent lighting overhead was cold, clinical, designed to expose every weakness. She was a fraud in a $5,000 dress, and they all knew it. I apologize, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Please continue. The man at the head of the table, Robert Chun, Jason's CFO according to the brief she'd memorized last night, didn't continue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression a careful blank that somehow communicated volumes of contempt. We were discussing the Meridian acquisition, he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. Perhaps you'd like to weigh in? Since you'll be involved in all company decisions moving forward. The way he said involved made her skin crawl. Julia opened the portfolio, buying herself 3 seconds to think. Inside were documents Jason's assistant had prepared, summaries, talking points, things she was supposed to understand but barely did. Numbers swam before her eyes. Profit margins. Quarterly projections. Risk assessments. I'm still reviewing the details, she said carefully. But I trust Mr. Chen's judgment on this matter. He's served Owens Industries well for 15 years, Chen interrupted. 15 years I've been making decisions for this company. I was here when Jason's father built this empire from nothing. I was here through every acquisition, every expansion, every crisis. His eyes, dark and sharp, fixed on her. Where were you, Mrs. Owens? The silence that followed was suffocating. Julia felt heat crawl up her neck. She knew what he wanted her to say, that she was mopping floors while they were making millions, that she had no business sitting in this chair, that she was nothing more than a dying man's last desperate mistake. But she also remembered Jason's face yesterday in the hospital room. The way he'd looked at her when he'd made his proposition. Continue the arrangement. Protect what I've built. And in return, I'll give you everything you need to protect what you love. Her mother's medical debt. Her future. Her dignity. She wouldn't let these men take that from her. I was working, Julia said quietly. Learning what it means when someone builds something from nothing. Learning what it costs. She met Chen's gaze directly. I may not have your 15 years, Mr. Chen, but I understand value. And I understand what happens when people mistake silence for ignorance. Chen's jaw tightened. Around the table, a few executives shifted uncomfortably. Bold words. A new voice drawled from the far end of the room. Julia's attention snapped to the man she'd been briefed about, but hadn't yet been introduced to. Marcus Voss sat slightly apart from the others, as if he existed in his own ecosystem. Silver hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if it weren't so coldly calculating. His suit was impeccable, his posture relaxed, but his eyes, pale gray, almost colorless, tracked her like a predator watching prey. I like bold, Voss continued, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. Jason always did have interesting taste. The way he said it made Julia's stomach turn. Mr. Voss is our largest external shareholder, Chen said, his tone careful now deferential. He holds 20% of company stock. His voice carries significant weight, particularly when the CEO is incapacitated, Voss added. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease, and began walking around the table toward her. Each step was measured, deliberate. Tell me, Mrs. Owens, what exactly is your husband's condition? Julia's fingers tightened on the portfolio. Jason's assistant had prepared her for this question, but hearing it from Voss's mouth felt different. Dangerous. He's recovering, she said. The treatment is working. How fortunate. Voss stopped directly beside her chair, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. This close she could smell his cologne, expensive, overwhelming. And in the meantime, you'll be making decisions on his behalf. We make decisions together. Do you? Voss's hand came to rest on the back of her chair, his fingers just inches from her shoulder. How modern. How egalitarian. He leaned down slightly, his voice dropping. Tell me, how long have you known my old friend Jason? I don't recall seeing you at any company functions before he collapsed. The room had gone completely silent. Every man at the table was watching this exchange like spectators at a gladiator fight. Julia's mind raced. She couldn't hesitate. Hesitation was blood in the water. But she also couldn't lie, not directly, not when any of these men could verify the truth with a single phone call to the right person. Our relationship was private, she said. Jason valued discretion. Jason valued many things, Voss replied. Control. Power. Privacy, yes. But also. He paused, his gray eyes scanning her face. Leverage. He was very good at finding people's weaknesses and using them. I wonder what weakness of yours he found. Julia stood abruptly, forcing Voss to step back. The movement was instinctive, defensive, but she channeled it into something that looked like authority. Gentlemen, she said, addressing the room. I understand this transition is difficult. Jason's illness has created uncertainty, and uncertainty makes us all uncomfortable. But let me be clear. I'm not here to replace him. I'm here to ensure his vision continues while he recovers. She looked directly at Voss. And I'm not interested in games. If you have concerns about company decisions, voice them. If you have questions about my qualifications, ask them directly. But don't mistake patience for weakness. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, some place that remembered what it felt like to be invisible and decided never to be invisible again. Voss's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those pale eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or intrigue. Fair enough, he said softly. Then louder to the room. I think we can table the Meridian discussion for now. Give Mrs. Owens time to review the materials thoroughly. He turned back to Julia. Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable? I'd love to hear more about how you plan to protect Jason's interests. Over dinner, perhaps? Every instinct Julia had screamed danger. I appreciate the offer, she said carefully. But my evenings are committed to being with my husband. Of course. Voss smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, but there was nothing warm in it. Family first. How admirable. He collected his briefcase from the table. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse me. Mrs. Owens, I look forward to our next meeting." He left the boardroom with the same measured confidence he'd entered with. But Julia felt the shift in atmosphere the moment the door closed behind him. The other executives began gathering their materials, conversations resuming in low murmurs. Chin shot her one last, unreadable look before departing. Within minutes, Julia was alone in the vast boardroom. She sank back into the leather chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the cool surface of the table, trying to ground herself, trying to remember how to breathe. The door opened again. Julia's head snapped up, her body tensing. Jason's assistant, Margaret, stepped inside. The older woman's expression was professionally neutral, but her eyes held something that might have been sympathy. "You did well," Margaret said quietly. She approached the table and set down a phone, Jason's phone. "He wants to speak with you." Julia stared at the device like it might bite her. "Now!" "He's been watching the meeting remotely. Security feed." Margaret gestured to a small camera in the corner of the room that Julia hadn't noticed. "He watches everything." The implication hung in the air. Jason had seen her struggle, seen her face down Voss, seen every moment of her fear and her desperate attempt to hide it. Margaret left without another word. Julia picked up the phone with trembling fingers and answered. She didn't say hello. She didn't know what to say. "You're stronger than you think." Jason's voice was rough, tired, but there was something else in it. Pride, maybe. Or possession. Voss knows it too now. That's why he's dangerous. Julia found her voice. "You could have warned me about him. Would it have helped?" A pause. "Or would you have been more nervous, knowing what he's capable of?" "What is he capable of?" The silence that followed was long enough that Julia thought the connection had dropped. Then quietly, "Everything, Julia. Marcus Voss is capable of everything. And now he knows you exist." Her blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" "It means the price of playing my wife just got higher," Jason said. "It means you need to be very, very careful. And it means..." Another pause. "I need you to come to the hospital. Now. There's something you need to know before Voss finds out first." "Finds out what?" "Who I really am," Jason said. "And what you've really agreed to protect." The line went dead. Julia stood alone in the empty boardroom, designer dress and all, with the terrible certainty that she'd just stepped off a cliff and was only now beginning to fall. Julia stood frozen in the doorway of Jason Owens' private bedroom, her hand still gripping the cold brass handle like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. He was awake. After 3 days of machines breathing for him, of doctors whispering in corridors with grave expressions, of her sitting in boardrooms pretending to be someone she wasn't, Jason Owens had opened his eyes. And now those eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with something between fear and electricity. He sat on the edge of his bed, barefoot, wearing only a black silk robe that hung open just enough to reveal the stark white bandages wrapped around his chest. The dim light from the single lamp on his nightstand carved shadows across his face. Sharp jaw, dark stubble, eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed mask. He looked weak, yes. The hollows under his cheekbones were more pronounced, and his normally commanding posture carried a slight tremor. But weakness on Jason Owens was like a crack in a diamond. It only made him more dangerously beautiful. "Come here," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but the command in it was unmistakable. Julia's feet refused to move. Behind her, the hallway stretched toward safety, toward the elevator that could take her down 60 floors and out of this glass tower, away from whatever was about to happen. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I should call the doctor," she managed, hating how her voice wavered. "You just woke up. I need," Jason interrupted softly, "to talk to my fiancé." The word hung in the air between them like a blade. Julia's fingers tightened on the door handle. He knew. Of course he knew. The doctors must have told him everything. How she'd authorized the experimental treatment, how she'd signed papers as Julia Owens, how she'd sat in his ICU room for hours pretending she had any right to be there. "Mr. Owens, I can explain." "Jason." He raised one hand, a simple gesture, but it silenced her instantly. If we're engaged, you should probably use my first name, don't you think? There was something in his tone she couldn't identify. Not quite anger. Not quite amusement. Something darker and far more complicated. Julia forced herself to take one step into the room. Then another. The door clicked shut behind her, and the sound made her flinch. Now she was trapped in here with him, in this intimate darkness that smelled of expensive cologne and the faint antiseptic trace of medical care. I didn't have a choice, she said, lifting her chin even though her pulse was racing. You were dying. The doctors said without the treatment. I know what the doctors said. Jason's eyes never left her face. I also know you used my black card. That you've been running my company. That you faced down Marcus Voss in a board meeting and didn't flinch when he tried to intimidate you. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. My assistant was very thorough in his briefing. Julia's stomach dropped. Then you know I was just trying to help. I'll leave. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign to say this was all a misunderstanding. I never meant to. Come. Here. This time, his voice carried an edge that made refusal impossible. Julia crossed the remaining distance on shaking legs until she stood directly in front of him. Close enough that she could see the 4 bruise on his hand, the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the way his chest rose and fell with each careful breath. Close enough to smell the warm, masculine scent of his skin beneath the silk. Jason looked up at her, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded flashed across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by that unreadable mask of control. Why did you do it? He asked quietly. I told you. You were dying, and I. No. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she didn't. His fingers caught her wrist, thumb pressing against her racing pulse. Why did you do it? A cleaner who I'd never met before that night. You could have walked away. You could have let the hospital deal with it. Instead, you committed fraud, risked criminal charges, and stepped into a world that could eat you alive. His grip tightened just slightly. Why? Julia stared down at his hand on her wrist. His touch was warm, solid, and far too gentle for a man who reportedly destroyed his enemies without hesitation. Because you looked at me, she whispered before she could stop herself. Jason's eyes narrowed. What? That night. When you collapsed. Julia swallowed hard, feeling heat rise to her cheeks, but unable to stop the truth from spilling out. You looked right at me. Not through me, not past me like every other person in that building does. You saw me, and then you trusted me with something precious. She gestured at the black card sitting on his nightstand. I don't know why, but I couldn't. I couldn't let you die after that. Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Jason's thumb traced a slow circle against her pulse point. Whether he was checking her heartbeat or deliberately making it race faster, she couldn't tell. What's your mother's name? He asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. What? Your mother. The one with the medical debt. What's her name? Rosa, Julia said carefully, suspicion creeping into her voice. Rosa Munoz. Why? Jason released her wrist and reached for his phone on the nightstand. His movements were slow, pained, but determined. He typed something quickly, then set the phone down and looked back at her. It's done, he said simply. What's done? The debt. It's cleared. All of it. He watched her face carefully. Consider it a thank you for saving my life. Julia's legs went weak. She grabbed the bedpost to steady herself. That's over $200,000. You can't just. I can do whatever I want, Jason said, and there was steel beneath the silk of his voice now. That's what you don't understand yet, Julia. In this world, in my world, money is just a tool. Power is what matters. And right now, you've stepped into a position of power that very dangerous people will want to take from you. Then I'll step out of it, Julia said quickly. I'll tell everyone the truth. That we're not engaged, that this was all just. No. The word cracked through the room like a whip. Julia stared at him. No. Jason pushed himself to his feet slowly, and even weakened, even barely recovered, he radiated the kind of authority that made her want to either run or kneel. He took a step toward her, then another, until he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "But in doing so, you made yourself a target. Marcus Voss knows your name now. So do half a dozen other people who would love nothing more than to exploit any weakness in my armor. If you walk away now, you become a loose end. A liability." His hand came up to cup her jaw, gentle but inescapable. "I don't leave loose ends, Julia." Her breath caught. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm protecting you," he corrected. "There's a difference." His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and she hated the way her body responded to his touch. A shiver running down her spine, heat pooling low in her belly. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to continue being my fiancé until I'm fully recovered, and until the threats against my company are neutralized. In exchange, your mother's debt is cleared, and when this is over, I'll set you up with enough money that you'll never have to clean another office in your life. And if I refuse?" Jason's smile was slow and dangerous. "You won't. You don't know that. Don't I?" He leaned in closer, his lips nearly brushing her ear. "Your hands are shaking, but you haven't pulled away. Your pulse is racing, but not from fear, not entirely anyway. You're curious about this world, about what it would be like to live in it instead of just watching from the shadows. And most importantly," his breath was warm against her neck, "you're not the kind of woman who walks away when someone needs her, even if that someone is dangerous." Julia closed her eyes, hating that he was right, hating that some reckless part of her wanted to stay, wanted to see what would happen next, wanted to know what it felt like to stand beside a man like Jason Owens instead of being invisible. "How long?" she asked hoarsely. 3 months. Maybe 4. Jason pulled back just enough to look at her face. "I need time to recover fully and to identify who's behind the recent attacks on my company. Once that's done, we'll stage a quiet breakup. You'll walk away with financial security and a non-disclosure agreement. Clean. Simple." "Nothing about this is simple," Julia muttered. "No," Jason agreed, and something flickered in his eyes, something almost like regret. "But it's the best option we have. For both of us." Julia should say no. Every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to refuse, to run, to get as far away from this man and his dangerous world as possible. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, "What would I have to do?" Jason's hand dropped from her face, and he took a step back, putting professional distance between them again. But his eyes never left hers. "Attend events with me. Live in this penthouse. Learn how to move in my circles. Convince people that you're exactly where you belong." His voice dropped lower. "And above all else, make Marcus Voss and everyone else believe that you're mine. Completely. Undeniably. Mine." The possessiveness in that last word should have terrified her. Instead, it sent heat coursing through her veins. "I don't know how to be what you need," Julia admitted quietly. "Then I'll teach you." Jason moved back to the bed, lowering himself carefully onto the edge, and she could see the exhaustion pulling at him now. But his gaze remained sharp, focused, absolute. "Starting tomorrow, you'll have tutors. Etiquette, finance, social dynamics. Everything you need to survive in this world. And tonight you go to the guest room 3 doors down and try to sleep. Tomorrow, everything changes." He paused, then added with dark certainty, "For both of us." Julia turned toward the door, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened, everything she'd just agreed to. She made it halfway there before his voice stopped her. "Julia." She looked back. Jason was watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher, something hungry and haunted all at once. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saving my life. I won't forget it." Julia nodded, not trusting her voice, and slipped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her, and she leaned against the wall, her legs finally giving out as she slid down to the floor. She'd just made a deal with the devil himself. And the terrifying part was how badly she wanted to see where it would lead. Behind the closed door, Jason sat in the darkness, his hand pressed against his chest where his heart was beating far too fast for a man who'd nearly died. He stared at the black card on his nightstand, the card that had somehow found its way into the hands of the one woman who could destroy him or save him. He'd lied to her, of course. This arrangement had nothing to do with convenience or protection. The moment he'd seen her face in that hospital room, the moment his assistant had told him everything she'd done, he'd known the truth with crystalline certainty. He wasn't going to let Julia Munoz walk away. Not in 3 months. Not ever. He just had to make her realize she didn't want to leave either. Jason reached for his phone and typed a message to his head of security. Full protection detail on Julia Munoz, effective immediately. I want to know everyone she talks to, everywhere she goes. And find out everything about her, every detail, every secret, every vulnerability. She's mine now, and I protect what's mine. Julia wasn't supposed to be in this part of the house. The West Wing was off limits. Jason had made that clear the first day she'd moved into the penthouse. My private study, he'd said, his tone leaving no room for questions. No one goes in there. Not the staff. Not you. But tonight she had a reason. She'd found the key 3 days ago, tucked inside a leather journal Jason thought he'd hidden well enough. The journal itself had been innocuous, business notes, meeting schedules, numbers that meant nothing to her. But tucked between 2 pages was a small brass key, and scrawled beside it in Jason's sharp handwriting, West Wing. 3rd door. Don't lose this. Julia told herself she was looking for answers. About the poison. About whoever wanted him dead. About why a man who could have anyone had chosen her, a woman who cleaned floors for a living, to wear his ring and stand beside him in a world that wanted to devour her whole. But deep down she knew the truth. She was terrified of what she might find. The study door opened with barely a whisper. Julia slipped inside, her breath catching as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. Moonlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting long shadows across walls lined with dark wood paneling and leather-bound books that looked older than she was. The air smelled like aged whiskey and old secrets. And then she saw it. The portrait. It dominated the far wall, massive, ornate, impossible to miss. A family frozen in time. A younger Jason, maybe 15 or 16, stood between 2 people who could only be his parents. His father was a stern, cold-faced man in an expensive suit, one hand resting on Jason's shoulder like a claim of ownership. His mother was beautiful in a haunting way, dark hair, sad eyes, a smile that didn't reach past her lips. But it was Jason who held Julia's attention. He looked so different. Thinner. Younger. And his eyes, God, his eyes held something she'd never seen in the man she knew. Fear. The kind that lived deep in your bones and never really left. Julia moved closer, her hand rising almost of its own accord. Her fingers brushed the ornate frame, tracing the edge of the canvas. What happened to you? She whispered. I grew up. Julia spun around, her heart slamming into her throat. Jason stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark and imposing against the light from the hallway. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. He was still wearing the clothes from dinner, black slacks, white shirt rolled to his elbows. But something about his posture screamed danger. How long had he been standing there? How much had he heard? I told you this room was off limits. His voice was quiet. Too quiet. I know. Julia's voice came out steadier than she felt. I wanted to understand. Understand what? You. She turned back to the portrait, refusing to let him intimidate her. Not now. Not when she was this close. Who you really are. What you're hiding. Silence stretched between them like a tightrope. Then she heard him move, footsteps crossing the hardwood floor, slow and deliberate. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. You want the truth? Jason's voice was low, dangerous. Or do you want the version that lets you sleep at night? Julia met his gaze. I want the truth. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or respect. He looked at the portrait, his jaw tightening. My father, he said finally, gesturing to the stern man in the painting, built his empire on blood money. Drugs. Weapons. Human trafficking. He laundered it through legitimate businesses, real estate, tech companies, hotels. By the time I was old enough to understand, the Owens name meant power in 2 worlds. The one you see in boardrooms and charity galas. And the one that operates in shadows. Julia's stomach twisted. She'd suspected, God, she'd suspected after everything with Marcus Voss, after the way people looked at Jason like he was something to fear. But hearing it confirmed was different. It made it real. And you? Her voice was barely above a whisper. What world do you live in? Jason's laugh was bitter. Both. Neither. I don't know anymore. He paused, his hand rising to touch the portrait, the same spot Julia had touched moments ago. I tried to leave once. Told my father I wanted out. I was 17, stupid enough to think I had a choice. What did he do? He took someone I loved. Jason's voice went flat, emotionless. A girl from school. Anna. She was, he stopped, swallowed hard. She was kind. And good. And she made me believe I could be something other than my father's son. Past tense. Julia's chest tightened. He had her killed, Jason continued. Made it look like an accident. Car crash on a rainy night. But I knew. Everyone in the family knew. It was a message. You don't leave. You don't choose love over legacy. You don't get to be weak. Julia's hand found his without thinking. His fingers were cold, rigid. The woman in the portrait, she said softly. Your mother. What happened to her? Jason's expression darkened. She tried to run too. Took me with her when I was 8. We made it as far as the airport before my father's men found us. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. He didn't kill her. That would have been mercy. He just broke her. Piece by piece. Until there was nothing left but the shell you see in that painting. Julia's eyes burned. She looked at the sad-eyed woman in the portrait, understanding now what she was seeing. A prisoner. A warning. She died when I was 20, Jason said. Pills. They called it an accident, but I knew better. She'd been dead for years. Her body just finally caught up. Jason. I gave you the card because you reminded me of her. The confession came out raw, brutal. Not physically, but the way you moved through the world. Invisible. Trying so hard not to take up space. Like you thought if you were small enough, quiet enough, life might forget to hurt you. Julia's breath hitched. That was too close. Too accurate. And Anna, she asked, even though part of her didn't want to know. Do I remind you of her too? Jason turned to face her fully, his hand coming up to cup her jaw. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and the touch was so gentle it made her ache. No, he said. You're nothing like Anna. She was gentle. Soft. He paused, searching for words. You're steel wrapped in silk. You've been through hell, and you're still standing. Still fighting. Anna never had that. And maybe if she had, she'd still be alive. Julia didn't know what to say. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together everything he'd told her. The crime family. The violence. The poison coursing through his veins. Wait. The poison, she breathed. You said someone close to you is doing this. Someone who has access. Someone who? My aunt. Jason's voice went cold. Catalina Owens. My father's sister. She's been running the criminal side of the family since he died 5 years ago. And she wants me dead. Why? Because I'm trying to dismantle everything my father built. The trafficking, the drugs. I've been quietly severing those connections, cleaning the blood money, making everything legitimate. She sees it as betrayal, as weakness. Julia's mind flashed to the gala, to Marcus Voss, to all the dangerous men circling like sharks. And the experimental treatment. Isn't a treatment. Jason's smile was sharp, humorless. It's an antidote. Catalina has the only doses. She's been poisoning me for months, slow enough that doctors thought it was a degenerative disease. Fast enough that I'd eventually have to come crawling to her, begging. But you didn't. No. I found you instead. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Julia's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What does that mean? She asked, even though part of her already knew. Part of her had known since the beginning. Jason's hand slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her closer, not roughly, but with an inevitability that made resistance impossible. It means, he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that made her pulse race, that you weren't random, Julia. The night I collapsed, the night I gave you the card, I'd been looking for you for weeks. Catalina let it slip once that she'd sent someone after Anna all those years ago. A hired hand. Someone disposable. A man named Munoz. The world tilted. "My father," Julia whispered. "Your father." Jason's eyes bore into hers. He was just a driver, low-level, expendable. But he was there the night Anna died. And when I started digging into his background years later, trying to find proof, I found something else. A daughter. A woman who'd spent her whole life cleaning up other people's messes, invisible, surviving. "You've been watching me." "Yes." "And the card, everything, it was all part of some plan for revenge." "It started that way." Jason's grip tightened, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. "I thought if I could find you, use you, I could get to Catalina. Prove what she'd done. Destroy her the way she destroyed everyone I ever loved." Julia's chest felt like it was caving in. "And now I'm in love with you." The words came out fierce, almost angry. "And I don't know if that makes me a better man or a more dangerous one. Because I should let you go. I should send you away before Catalina figures out what you mean to me. But I can't. God help me, I can't." Julia couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Everything she'd thought she understood about her life, about Jason, about them. It was all twisted up in blood and lies and a dead girl she'd never met. She should run. She should grab her things and disappear before this world swallowed her whole. But when Jason's lips brushed against hers, soft, questioning, giving her one last chance to walk away, Julia didn't move. She kissed him back. And in that moment she knew she wasn't leaving. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Even if it killed them both. When they finally pulled apart, Jason's eyes were dark, haunted. "There's more," he said. "Things about your father. About what he knew. About why Catalina really wanted him dead. Tell me. Tomorrow. Tonight." He paused, his hand coming up to touch her face like he was memorizing it. "Tonight, I just need you to know the truth. All of it. And then you can decide if you still want to stay." Julia's heart was screaming at her to demand answers now. To know everything. But when she looked into Jason's eyes, she saw something that stopped her. Fear. Not of Catalina. Not of death. Fear that when Julia knew everything, she'd finally see him the way he saw himself. As a monster. "Tomorrow," Julia agreed softly. Jason pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her like he could shield her from the truth that was coming. Like he could protect her from the very darkness he'd dragged her into. But as Julia stood there in his study, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the portrait of a family built on blood, she realized something that should have terrified her. She wasn't afraid of his darkness anymore. She was afraid of her own. Because somewhere between that first night in the hospital and this moment in his arms, Julia Munoz had stopped being the invisible cleaner who just wanted to survive. She'd become someone willing to burn the world down if it meant protecting the man she loved. And that, she was starting to realize, made her more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. She caught one last glimpse of Jason before Marcus pulled her into the shadowed corridor. His face was a mask of controlled rage, every muscle in his body coiled like a predator about to strike. But he didn't move. Couldn't move, not without ruining the entire operation. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, Julia saw something that terrified her more than Marcus's knowing smile. Jason was afraid. Not for himself, but for her. The private room was decorated in deep burgundy and gold, intimate in a way that felt suffocating. A single bottle of champagne sat chilling in a bucket, 2 glasses beside it. Marcus closed the door behind them with a soft click that sounded like a prison cell locking. "You can drop the act," Marcus said, releasing her hand and walking to pour himself a drink. "I've known since the hospital who you really are. A cleaner. A nobody. A convenient face that resembled a dead girl." Julia's heart stopped. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please." Marcus turned, swirling the champagne in his glass. "Did you really think no one would investigate Jason Owens's mysterious new bride? I have copies of your employment records, Miss Munoz. 2 years cleaning offices in the Owens Tower. Minimum wage. Night shift. Invisible." He took a sip, watching her over the rim of his glass. "The question is, what is Jason planning? Why the elaborate charade? Julia's mind raced. Every instinct told her to stay silent, but Marcus was between her and the door. The diamond choker around her throat suddenly felt like a noose. "I'm his wife," she said, forcing steel into her voice. "Whatever conspiracy theories you've—" "I'll make you a deal," Marcus interrupted, setting down his glass. "I know Jason suspects someone in his inner circle is betraying him. I know he's using you to flush them out. And I know that right now he's listening to every word through that pretty necklace." Julia's hand flew to her throat. Marcus's smile widened. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell Jason whatever I tell you to tell him. Feed him false information about who's betraying him. Let him down the wrong path. Do that, and I'll keep your secret. Refuse, and by tomorrow morning, every news outlet in the city will know that Jason Owens's marriage is a fraud. His credibility destroyed. His company vulnerable." "Why?" Julia whispered. "Why are you doing this?" "Because Jason Owens has something that belongs to me," Marcus said, his affable mask slipping to reveal something cold and hungry underneath. "And I intend to take it back. With interest." Before Julia could respond, her phone buzzed in the small clutch she'd been allowed to carry. She pulled it out with shaking hands. An unknown number. A single message. "The antidote Jason needs. I have it. But first, you must retrieve something from his personal safe. Instructions to follow. C.A. Catalina Ashford. Jason's aunt, the matriarch of the rival crime family." Julia stared at the message, her world narrowing to two impossible choices. Betray Jason by spying for Marcus, or betray him by stealing for Catalina. Either way, she was trapped. "Trouble?" Marcus asked, too casually. Julia looked up at him, then at the door where she knew Jason was somewhere beyond, listening, waiting, trusting her to handle this. The woman who'd cleaned floors and been invisible would have crumbled, would have chosen the safest path, the one that protected herself first. But Julia Munoz was no longer that woman. She met Marcus's eyes and made her choice. "No trouble at all," she said softly, slipping the phone back into her clutch. "Just my husband checking on me. He's very protective." Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. "You didn't answer my proposal." "I didn't need to." Julia straightened her spine, channeling every ounce of the power she'd learned from watching Jason command rooms. "You see, Mr. Voss, you made one critical mistake tonight." "And what's that?" Julia smiled, and this time it wasn't forced. "You assumed I was still just the cleaner, that I was something to be used and discarded. But I learned something living in Jason's world." She took a step toward him, her fear transforming into something sharper, more dangerous. "The people who underestimate women like me? They're always the first to fall." The elevator doors closed behind Julia with a sound like a coffin sealing shut. She stood frozen in Jason Owens' penthouse, still wearing the crimson gown that had made her a spectacle at the auction. A piece of bait dangled before predators. The fabric clung to her like a second skin, beautiful and suffocating. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below them, a million lights that suddenly felt like a million eyes watching her make the choice that would define the rest of her life. Or end it. Jason stood 15 feet away, his back to her, staring out at that same glittering darkness. He'd discarded his tuxedo jacket somewhere between the car and the elevator. His white shirt was partially unbuttoned, the sleeves rolled to his forearms in a gesture that seemed almost violent, as if he'd torn at the fabric to breathe. His shoulders were rigid, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He hadn't said a word since they'd left the gala. Not in the car. Not in the elevator. Not now. The silence was a living thing between them, thick with everything unsaid. Julia's heels clicked against the marble floor as she moved deeper into the penthouse. Each step felt deliberate, final. She'd been here before, had cleaned these very floors in the dead of night when she'd been invisible, when she'd been no one. Now she was someone. The question was, who? "You need to leave." Jason's voice cut through the silence, rough and low. He still didn't turn around. "Pack whatever you need. I'll have money wired to an account under a different name. You can go anywhere. Europe, South America, somewhere they'll never find you." Julia stopped walking. Her hands trembled, so she curled them into fists, pressing them against the silk of her gown. Is that what you want? What I want doesn't matter. That's not an answer. Finally, he turned. The city lights behind him cast his face in shadow, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes, those dark, dangerous eyes that had looked at her like she was salvation and damnation all at once, refused to meet hers. Marcus Voss knows you're not really my fiancé, Jason said, his voice carefully controlled. Catalina knows something's wrong. And after tonight, after using you as bait, I've painted a target on your back that will never disappear. So yes, Julia. Leave. That's my answer. She took 3 steps toward him. Then 3 more. You're lying. His eyes finally snapped to hers, something feral flickering in their depths. I'm trying to save your life. By pushing me away. By sending me into hiding like a criminal. Her voice rose, months of fear and confusion and buried rage finally breaking through. I've spent my entire life being invisible, Jason. Cleaning up after people who never saw me. And then you gave me that card and suddenly I mattered. Suddenly I was seen. You mattered because you looked like her, he said, and the words came out like a confession torn from somewhere deep and bleeding. Because when I was dying, delirious, I looked up and saw Julia Munoz, and all I could see was Elena Rose. The name hung between them like a ghost. Julia had heard whispers about Elena Rose, Jason's younger sister, the girl who'd tried to escape the Owens family legacy and paid for it with her life. But no one spoke about her directly. It was a wound too deep, too dangerous to touch. What are you saying? Julia whispered. Jason moved then, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped just inches away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the barely controlled chaos in his eyes. Close enough to touch, but he didn't. His hands remained at his sides, shaking with the effort of restraint. I'm saying that when I collapsed in that building, I thought I was hallucinating. I thought grief and poison had finally broken my mind because there she was, my sister's face, her name, standing over me like an angel come to drag me to hell or heaven. I didn't care which. His voice cracked, raw and honest in a way she'd never heard before. I gave you that card because I was dying and I wanted to see if you were real. If she was real. If there was any mercy left in this goddamn world. Julia's breath caught. Her hand moved without permission, rising to press against his chest. Partly to push him away, partly to feel the thundering of his heart beneath her palm. Proof that he was as affected as she was. And when you woke up, when you realized I wasn't her. Jason's hand came up, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. Not roughly, but firmly, an anchor. His thumb pressed against her racing pulse. When I woke up, I realized I didn't want you to be her. I wanted you to be exactly who you are. Julia Munoz. The woman who saved my life. The woman who walked into my world wearing a fake smile and a borrowed dress, and somehow made it all feel bearable. Tears burned behind Julia's eyes. She refused to let them fall. Then why are you sending me away? Because loving you might be what kills you. The confession detonated between them like a grenade. Julia stared at him, at this man who'd turned her life into chaos and danger and something terrifyingly close to purpose. This man who'd given her power and then tried to take it back for her own protection. This man who looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. You don't get to make that choice for me, she said softly, fiercely. You don't get to decide what I can survive. Julia, I'm not your sister, Jason. I'm not some fragile thing that needs to be hidden away. She stepped closer, eliminating the last inch of space between them. Her hand slid from his chest to his face, fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. I walked into this world with my eyes open. I knew what you were, what you are. And I'm still here. His control shattered. She saw it happen, the moment the careful walls he'd built around himself crumbled. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, fingers tangling in her hair, and he pulled her to him with a desperation that stole her breath. If you stay, he said, his forehead pressed against hers, his voice a ragged whisper. There's no going back. No clean exit. You'll be bound to me, to this family, to everything dark and bloody and unforgivable about this life. They'll come for us, Julia. Marcus, Catalina, everyone who wants what we have. And I won't always be able to protect you. Julia's heart hammered against her ribs. Fear coursed through her veins like ice water. But stronger than fear was something else. Something fierce and unbreakable that had been growing since the moment she'd chosen to use his card, to save his life, to step into his world. Choice. Then teach me to protect myself, she whispered. Stop treating me like something fragile, and start treating me like your equal. Because that's the only way we survive this, Jason. Together. As partners. For a long moment he just stared at her, searching her face for doubt, for fear, for any sign that she didn't understand what she was agreeing to. He found none. God help us both, he breathed, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was nothing like she'd imagined. It wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was claiming, desperate, a collision of two people who'd been circling each other for too long. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him, and she responded with equal hunger, her fingers digging into his shoulders as if she could anchor herself to this moment, this choice, this man who was both her salvation and her destruction. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jason rested his forehead against hers again. "You're sure?" he asked one last time, giving her one final chance to run. Julia thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago. The invisible cleaner who'd scrubbed floors and dreamed of nothing because dreaming hurt too much. She thought about her mother, safe now in a facility that Julia could never have afforded on her own. She thought about the power thrumming through her veins, the knowledge that she mattered, that she could shape the world instead of just surviving it. She thought about the darkness ahead, the enemies circling, the secrets still buried, the violence that would inevitably come. And then she looked into Jason Owen's eyes and saw her own reflection. Someone who'd chosen to stop being a victim and become something more dangerous. "I'm sure," she said, and sealed her fate with another kiss. Outside the windows, the city glittered on, indifferent to the birth of its newest queen, one who'd risen from nothing and chosen darkness with her eyes wide open. And in the shadows of that same city, phones buzzed with a single message sent to a dozen dangerous people. She didn't leave. Moved to Phase 2. The game had only just begun. The antidote arrived in a black briefcase at 3:47 a.m., delivered by a man whose face Julia never saw. She stood in the private medical wing of Jason's penthouse, watching Dr. Reyes examine the vial with hands that trembled despite his decades of experience. The liquid inside was clear, unremarkable, like water that cost a life to obtain. "Marcus Voss is dead," Jason said from the doorway behind her, his voice carrying none of the satisfaction she'd expected. "His body was found in his car 2 hours ago. Single gunshot. The police will rule it suicide by morning." Julia didn't turn around. She'd learned enough about Jason's world in the past weeks to understand what that clinical tone meant. Marcus hadn't killed himself, but he'd made the mistake of thinking he could poison Jason Owens and walk away with Catalina Ashford's money and a corporate empire. No one made that mistake twice. "And Catalina?" Julia asked quietly. "Disappeared. Likely out of the country by now." Jason moved closer, and she felt the heat of him at her back. "She's smart enough to know when she's lost." Dr. Reyes cleared his throat. "The compound is genuine. It's exactly what we've been searching for." He looked at Jason with something like wonder. "Mr. Owens, this will counteract the poison completely. Within 72 hours, you'll be fully recovered." Julia's knees went weak. She gripped the edge of the medical table, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. "Not yet. Not in front of the doctor." "Then administer it," Jason said simply. "Sir, there are risks." "Now, Dr. Reyes." The doctor nodded and began preparing the injection. Julia watched every movement with an intensity that made her eyes burn. This was it. The moment that would either save him or kill him faster. Jason's hand found hers on the table, his fingers threading through hers with a gentleness that felt wrong coming from a man who'd just ordered someone's death with the same breath. "Julia, look at me." She couldn't. If she looked at him, she'd shatter. "Julia." His other hand came up to her chin, turning her face toward him with inexorable patience. His eyes were clearer than they'd been in weeks, the gray depths sharp and focused. He looked almost healthy, but she knew better. The poison was still there, still killing him cell by cell. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you need to understand something." "Don't." Her voice cracked. "Don't you dare give me a goodbye speech when you're about to take that injection." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "Not a goodbye. A truth." His thumb brushed her cheekbone, catching a tear she hadn't meant to shed. "You saved my life the moment you walked into my office 3 months ago. The antidote is just finishing what you started." "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "I was just everything." The word was fierce, absolute. "You were everything I'd forgotten I needed. The poison was killing me, yes. But I was already dying before that, Julia. I just didn't know it until I saw you standing there with your cleaning cart and your stubborn eyes, refusing to leave me bleeding on the floor." Dr. Reyes approached with the syringe. "Mr. Owens, if you're ready." Jason didn't look away from her. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." He released her hand and rolled up his sleeve. Julia watched the needle slide into his vein, watched the clear liquid disappear into his bloodstream. Watched him for any sign of distress, any indication that this cure was another poison in disguise. Nothing. He didn't even flinch. "Heart rate stable," Dr. Reyes murmured, checking the monitors. "Blood pressure normal. No immediate adverse reactions." "How long before we know if it worked?" Julia asked. 24 hours for initial results. 72 for complete recovery." The doctor began packing his equipment. "I'll stay on site for the next week to monitor. But Mr. Owens, you need to rest now. The antidote will work best if your body isn't under additional stress." Jason nodded. "Thank you, doctor. My security team will show you to your quarters." When they were alone, the silence stretched between them like a living thing. Julia stared at the empty vial on the table, at the small drop of liquid still clinging to the glass. Such a small thing to hold a life in balance. "Come here," Jason said softly. She went to him without hesitation, and he pulled her into his arms with a strength that belied his supposed weakness. His hand curved around the back of her neck, holding her against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat. Strong, steady, alive. "I need to tell you something," he murmured against her hair. "Something I should have told you weeks ago." Julia's breath caught. "Jason. Your mother." He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "The connection Catalina mentioned. It's real." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "What?" "Your father, Emilio Muñoz, he didn't just work for my family. He was my father's half-brother. Illegitimate, never acknowledged, but blood nonetheless." Jason's jaw tightened. "That makes you family, Julia. Distant, complicated family, but family." She couldn't process the words. They bounced around her skull like bullets, tearing through everything she thought she understood. "You knew," she breathed. "When you gave me that card, when you knew who I was?" "Not at first. I swear to you, not at first." His hands tightened on her arms. "When I collapsed that night and saw you standing there, I thought I was hallucinating. You looked so much like Elena Rose, like my sister, that I thought I was dying and seeing ghosts. I gave you the card because I was out of my mind with fever and poison and guilt." "But later," Julia said numbly. "You found out later. 3 days after I woke up. My investigators traced your background while I was unconscious." He didn't look away, didn't try to soften it. "I knew before I asked you to continue the arrangement. I knew, and I used it. The betrayal should have crushed her. Should have sent her running from this room, this man, this life she'd never asked for. But all she felt was a strange, cold clarity." "Why?" she asked. "Why use me if you already knew the truth?" "Because you were the perfect solution to a problem I'd been trying to solve for years." Jason's voice was flat, clinical. "My father's greatest shame was abandoning Emilio's mother, leaving her pregnant and alone. That sin has haunted our family, given Catalina and others leverage, ammunition to question my father's judgment, my own legitimacy as his heir. But if I could find Emilio's daughter, acknowledge her, bring her into the family publicly." "You could erase the scandal," Julia finished. "Make it a redemption story instead of a buried secret." "Yes." He didn't apologize, didn't ask for forgiveness. You were useful, Julia. Strategic. The perfect chess piece. She should slap him. Should scream. Should demand he never touch her again. Instead, she laughed. It was a broken sound, sharp and bitter, and it made Jason's expression finally crack into something like fear. Julia. No. She stepped back out of his reach. You don't get to confess and expect absolution. You used me. You manipulated me. You built this entire relationship on lies and strategy. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold. So tell me, Jason, right now, in this moment, am I still just a chess piece? Or did something change? He stared at her for a long moment. The machines hummed in the background. Outside the windows, dawn was beginning to break over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and blood. Everything changed, he said finally. The moment you looked at Marcus Voss across that gala floor and didn't break. The moment you stood in that boardroom and fought for my company like it was yours. The moment you chose to stay when you could have walked away with enough money to disappear forever. He moved toward her slowly, like approaching a wild thing. I fell in love with you, Julia. Not the strategy, not the usefulness, you. The woman who cleaned floors and saved dying CEOs and refused to be anything less than exactly who she is. Pretty words, she whispered. How do I know they're real? Jason reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He held it out to her. Because I had this drawn up 3 weeks ago, before we knew about the antidote. Before we knew if I'd even survive. Julia took the paper with shaking hands. Unfolded it. Read the legal language that made her head spin. Transfer of ownership. 50% of Owens Industries. In the name of Julia Munoz, to be executed upon Jason Owens's death or incapacitation, regardless of marital status. You're giving me half your company, she said flatly. I'm giving you the power to destroy me if you choose. His smile was blade sharp. If I'm lying about loving you, if I'm still using you, all you have to do is wait for the next poison, the next assassination attempt. Let me die. You'll inherit everything and owe me nothing. Not your loyalty, not your love, not even your grief. That's insane. That's trust. He cupped her face in both hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. I'm putting my life, my empire, my legacy in your hands, Julia. Because you already own my heart. What's a company compared to that? She wanted to stay angry. Wanted to hold on to the betrayal, the manipulation, the cold calculation that had brought them together. But the document in her hands was real. The vulnerability in his eyes was real. And the heart beating in his chest, saved by medicine but healed by her, that was real too. If I stay, she said slowly, it's not as your pawn, not as your redemption or your strategy. Then stay as my partner. His forehead touched hers. My equal. My wife, not in name only but in truth. Stand beside me and build something better than what we inherited. Help me turn this empire of blood into something worth believing in. Julia closed her eyes, felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her shoulders. She could walk away. Should walk away. Take the money, the power, the freedom he was offering and disappear into a life where men like Jason Owens were just stories on the news. But she'd stopped being just a cleaner the night she'd refused to let him die alone on a marble floor. 72 hours, she said finally. We wait 72 hours to make sure the antidote works. If you survive, if the poison is truly gone. She opened her eyes and met his gaze. Then we start over. No lies. No strategies. Just two people trying to build something real out of the wreckage. And if I don't survive, his voice was barely a whisper. Then I take your company and burn it to the ground. She smiled, sharp and dangerous. Because I loved you enough to save you, Jason. But I'll love myself enough to destroy anyone who tries to use me again. Even your ghost. He laughed, a real laugh, full of genuine delight and something like pride. God, you're magnificent. I'm a cleaner who learned to play your games, Julia corrected. Don't forget it. Never. He kissed her then, soft and deep and full of promises that might be lies or might be truth. She kissed him back and didn't let herself care which. They stood there in the dawn light, two people bound by blood and poison and choices that might destroy them both. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, a dying man was choosing to live, and a woman who'd started with nothing was discovering she'd gained everything, including the terrifying freedom to walk away from it. But not yet. Not for 72 more hours. And maybe, just maybe, not ever. Could you love someone from such a dark world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because their story isn't over yet. Watch out for part 2.